Shed hunting is not hunting in any sense that involves a weapon or a tag or a season opener marked on the calendar. It is walking. It is patience. It is the particular pleasure of learning a piece of mountain terrain so completely that you know where the bucks travel in December, where they bed in January, where they drop their antlers in February when the testosterone has ebbed and the weight of the rack has become something the body no longer wants to carry. A shed antler on the ground is one of the best things a person who loves deer can find. It is evidence. It is proof that a specific buck made it through another season, that he fed and bred and survived and will be back in the fall. It is a connection, physical, actual, to an animal you have been watching and thinking about and hoping to encounter again. The people who shed hunt in these Virginia mountains know this feeling completely. They understand why a brown line of tine against the brown of last year's leaves can stop a person's heart in the best possible way. They understand the specific, irreplaceable satisfaction of picking up something the mountain gave you voluntarily. What 3 shed hunters found on the south-facing slope of Iron Mountain in Smyth County last March was not something the mountain gave voluntarily. It was something the mountain had been keeping for a very long time, in a clearing that no one had ever found because nothing about the approach to it encouraged approach. Not the terrain, not the deer sign, not any of the indicators that experienced shed hunters use to read the land. They found it anyway. And when they found it, something in the clearing became aware that it had been found. This is the Antler Grove, Virginia blood and bone. Some collections are not meant to be discovered. The 3 of them, Nate Holbrook, 44, his younger brother Cody, 39, and their friend Marcus Webb, 41, had been shed hunting Iron Mountain together for 11 years. 11 years of the same March ritual. Park at the gate on the Forest Service Road, sign the access register, split up along the 3 main south-facing drainages they had identified as their most productive zones, and work back toward the central ridge over the course of the day, comparing finds at the truck in the afternoon. In 11 years, they had found, collectively, over 400 sheds from the Iron Mountain herd, a number that spoke to both the richness of the terrain and the quality of their scouting, their trail cameras, and their combined understanding of how the deer on that mountain moved through the winter months. They were serious about it. Not competitive in any unpleasant way, but serious. The way people were serious about things that rewarded serious attention, that gave back in proportion to what you put in. Nate kept a log, dates, locations, estimated ages, rack characteristics. He had matched several sheds to specific bucks over multiple seasons, building a picture of individual animals' lives that he found genuinely moving, the specific trajectory of a particular deer across the years, the way a rack changed as the animal aged, the record of a life being lived in the mountain terrain he walked every March. Iron Mountain was good deer country. The south-facing slopes held warmth longer than the north-facing ridges. The timber was a mix of old hardwood and younger clear-cut regeneration that provided both mast and browse, and the creek drainages along the mountain's base offered water and corridor travel. The deer were there, and the deer were healthy, and every March the mountain gave up what it was going to give up, and it was enough. None of them had ever worked the south-facing slope between the 2 main drainages. Not because they hadn't thought about it. The slope between the drainages looked good on the topo maps and the satellite imagery, the right aspect, the right timber type, the right terrain features for winter bedding. But every time any of them had approached it, something about the angle of the approach had diverted them. A better deer trail pulling them left, a fresh scrub line suggesting a buck had gone the other way. The kind of small navigational decisions that accumulate over a day of shed hunting and leave you at the end of the day having covered ground you didn't plan to cover and missed ground you intended to. In 11 years, the middle slope had simply never gotten walked. On the 3rd Saturday of March, it did. Nate found the clearing first. He had pushed east through a thick stand of mountain laurel that he normally would have gone around and come out on the far side of it into a brief open corridor between the laurels and a stand of large white oaks, and the corridor pointed him upslope toward a brightening in the timber that suggested a gap in the canopy, and he followed the light the way shed hunters followed anything that promised a view. He stopped at the edge of the gap. He stood there for a long time before he called for Cody and Marcus. The clearing was roughly 60 feet across, roughly circular, set into the slope with the uphill side bounded by a limestone outcrop and the downhill side opening into the hardwood stand. The canopy above was partially open. A mature oak had come down at some point, taking a hole in the canopy, and the gap in the overstory let in enough light that the clearing floor was visible in full detail from the edge. The floor was covered in antler sheds. Not scattered, not the random distribution of sheds that accumulated in a bedding area or a natural concentration point over time. Arranged, every shed oriented with its tines pointing inward toward the center of the clearing, its base plate facing outward, the individual pieces laid close but not overlapping, concentric ring upon concentric ring of shed antlers covering every square foot of visible ground from the clearing's edge to its center. Nate stood at the edge and tried to count. He stopped at 120. There were more than that, many more. He could see the clearing floor was multiple layers deep in places, older sheds beneath newer, the accumulation of many years compressed to a thickness he couldn't estimate without getting closer. Cody arrived first, pushing through the laurels behind him. He stopped at Nate's shoulder and said nothing for a long time. "How?" he said finally. Not a full question, just the beginning of one that didn't have an end he was ready to reach. Marcus came through 2 minutes later. His reaction was different from the brothers. Where they had gone silent, he made a sound that was half laugh and half something else, a sound of cognitive dissonance, of a person whose framework for understanding what they were looking at had just failed completely. "What is this?" he said. Not a question either. They stood at the edge for a long time before any of them moved. Nate was the one who started examining. It was his nature. He was the log keeper, the systematic one, the person for whom understanding required close observation. He crouched at the edge of the outer ring and studied the nearest sheds without touching them. The outer ring was old. The antlers there were weathered to the color and texture of aged bone, pale gray-brown, the surface rough and chalky, the structural integrity compromised by decades of freeze-thaw and moisture. He had found old sheds before. A shed antler's condition gave a rough estimate of its age. These were not 1 year old, not 2 or 3. These were 15, 20 years old at the outer ring, maybe more. Moving inward, and he could see the concentric organization clearly now, the rings moving from oldest at the edge to newest at the center, the sheds became progressively fresher. The middle rings were perhaps 5 to 10 years old by their condition. The inner rings were recent. Some of them looked like they could have been dropped this past February. The innermost ring, around whatever was at the center, was the most recent of all. He studied the arrangement for several minutes. "It adds a ring every year," he said. "What does?" Cody said. "Whatever put this here. It adds the newest sheds to the inside every year. The older ones get pushed to the outside as the years pass, like tree rings growing outward from the center." Marcus was looking at the number of rings visible, counting. "How many years?" he said. Nate looked at the outer ring, at the furthest extent of the arrangement. "At least 30, he said, "maybe more. The oldest material at the outer edge, I can't date it precisely just by looking, but 30 years is a conservative estimate." They looked at each other. "We've been shed hunting this mountain for 11 years. Every March, we walk most of the south-facing slopes." "Not this slope," Nate said. "We should have found this. In 11 years, we should have come across—" "We didn't," Nate said. "Something about the approach has always taken us the other way. Both drainages pull you away from this slope. I've thought about working this section every year, and I've never made it here." He looked at the clearing. "I don't think that was an accident," he said. He said it quietly, without drama. The way he said things he had considered carefully before saying. Neither Cody nor Marcus responded immediately. They all three looked at the clearing for a moment, at the hundreds of shed antlers arranged with a precision and a patience that no human activity could explain. Then Nate said, "There's something in the center." He had noticed it as a shape rather than a thing, a mass at the precise geometric center of the arrangement, slightly elevated above the surrounding shed level, roughly the size and general form of a large boulder or a dense accumulation of material. But it was not a boulder. The slope had no exposed rock at this point. The limestone outcrop was at the uphill edge of the clearing 20 feet away. And the shape was not the haphazard heap of an accumulation. It had form, intentional form. He moved to the edge of the outer ring. He did not step into the arrangement. This was an instinct rather than a decision, something in the geometry of it, in the clear organization of the rings, in the way the tines all pointed inward toward the center, suggested that the arrangement had a boundary and that the boundary was not meant to be crossed casually. He crouched at the outer edge and looked in. The center mass was built from antlers too, the oldest, the most completely weathered, selected for specific characteristics he couldn't yet identify from this distance, stacked and interlocked in a way that was structurally deliberate, not a pile, a construction, the way a practiced hand built something to last. And on top of the construction, at its highest point, a single fresh shed. This season's, the tines still carrying the slight waxy quality of very new bone, the velvet attachment points still defined. Placed there recently, days ago perhaps this week. He stared at it. "What's holding it together?" Marcus said. He had come to stand beside Nate at the outer edge. "I don't know." "No mortar, no binding, just stacked?" "Interlocked," Nate said, "the way dry-stacked stone walls work, the pieces selected and fitted so the structure supports itself." He paused. "Someone spent a long time on that." "Not someone," Cody said. He was still a few steps back from the edge, and his voice had a quality in it that made both Nate and Marcus look at him. "There are no boot prints, no human sign at all in this clearing, no tracks in the outer ring, no disturbance in the leaf litter between the sheds. Whatever built this, whatever maintains it, it's not leaving the kind of sign a person leaves." They looked at the ground. Cody was right. The outer ring of sheds was settled into the leaf litter with the permanence of objects that had been undisturbed for years. The leaf litter between them was compressed and layered in the way ground became when nothing stepped on it. There was no human footprint anywhere in the clearing, not one. They stood at the outer edge for a long time. Nate photographed it, methodically, covering every angle, close-ups of the outer ring sheds to document their age condition, wider shots to capture the arrangement, images of the center construction. When he reviewed the photographs on his camera screen, something in them made him stop. He looked at one image for a long time. Then he looked up at the clearing. "Look at the center," Nate said. "Look at the tines on the shed on top." Cody and Marcus looked. "The tines, look at the direction the tines are pointing on the shed on top." They looked. The fresh shed on top of the center construction had its tines pointing outward, away from the center, toward the edge of the clearing. Every other shed in the arrangement had its tines pointing inward. Every single one, across every ring. Every one except the newest. The newest was facing out, facing the edge of the clearing, facing them. Nate lowered his camera. He looked at the fresh shed on top of the construction, at the tines pointing outward, toward the edge where they were standing. He looked at the clearing around them, at the 100+ antlers all pointing inward, at 30 years of collected material arranged in a pattern that had required consistent, patient, purposeful attention over 3 decades. He thought about Cody's observation. No boot prints, no human sign. He thought about the 11 years they had shed-hunted this mountain and never once reached this clearing, the way the approach had always deflected them, the way some small navigational decision had always taken them the other way. He thought about the fresh shed placed this season, possibly this week, at the top of the construction, with its tines pointing at him. "It knows we're here," he said. The words fell into the clearing's quiet. Neither Cody nor Marcus argued with them. The fresh shed wasn't there before, or it wasn't oriented that way before. When we first looked at the clearing, I wasn't close enough to read the tine direction on the top piece, but I think it was pointing inward, the same as the others. "You think it changed while we were standing here?" Cody said. "I think something changed it," Marcus said. They stood at the edge of the clearing. The timber around them was quiet in the way that timber was quiet when they were the only people on the mountain, the ordinary, uninhabited quiet of a March morning in the Iron Mountain hardwoods. Birds, distant wind, creek sound from the drainage below. But within the clearing itself, something had changed in the quality of the air. Not a sound, not a temperature change, a presence. The specific, unmistakable quality of being in a space that contains something that knew you were in it. The same quality Nate had felt in deer stands when a mature buck was moving nearby but not yet visible. The sense of a large awareness and proximity that registered before any physical evidence confirmed it. He had always trusted that sense. He trusted it now. "We should go," he said. "We haven't—" Marcus started. "We should go," Nate said again. His voice had the same quality as Advance's voice on the ridgeline, the quality of a man who had decided something and was not repeating himself for discussion. They went. They were 100 yards from the clearing, moving downslope through the hardwoods toward the laurel stand when Cody stopped. "There's something behind us," he said. Nate and Marcus stopped. They all three looked back upslope. The hardwoods were open enough at this section that they could see perhaps 70 yards back toward the clearing, or rather toward the trees that stood between them and the clearing. The clearing itself was not visible from here. Nothing was visible in the timber above them. "What did you see?" Nate said. "Movement," Cody said. "In the clearing, or at the edge of it, something moved." "A deer," Marcus said. "I know what a deer looks like," Cody said. It wasn't a deer. They looked at the timber above them for a long time. Nothing moved. The morning was quiet and still, and the hardwoods showed them nothing except bare March timber and the previous year's leaf litter and the slope going up to wherever the clearing was. "What did it look like?" Nate said. Cody looked at the timber. He started twice to answer and stopped both times. "Big," he said finally. "It was large, and it was at the edge of the clearing, not in the timber, at the edge, looking down slope." He paused, looking toward us. Nate looked at the timber above them. "Could you see what it was?" he said. "No," Cody said. "Not clearly. It didn't have a clear outline, like looking at something through water. The shape was there, but the details—" He stopped. "I couldn't tell what it was. I can tell you how big it was." "How big?" Marcus said. Cody looked at him. He said a number. Marcus and Nate both looked at him. "That's not possible," Marcus said. "I know," Cody said. He looked back up the slope one more time. Nothing in the timber, nothing at the edge of where the clearing would be. "Let's go," he said. They went, down the slope, through the laurels, back to the Forest Service road and the truck and the register at the gate and the drive back to town. They did not compare fines at the truck. They did not speak much on the drive. The number Cody had given, the size of the thing at the edge of the clearing, sat in the cab of the truck with them the whole way home, taking up space, not diminishing. None of the three have returned to Iron Mountain. Nate told me this without particular regret and without bravado. Not the statement of a man who was afraid to go back and was performing courage about it, but the statement of a man who had looked at what he'd found and made a considered decision that the mountain had offered him something he was not going to take. He had shown me the photographs. They were extraordinary. The cleared circle of antlers, the concentric rings, the center construction with its single fresh shed angled outward. Everything was exactly as he'd described it. The arrangement was real. The scale of it was real, and the tine direction on the top shed was visible in the photographs, pointing outward, toward wherever they were standing when the image was taken. I asked him whether he had tried to find any explanation for it, a human one, some hunting or wildlife activity that might account for what he'd seen. He said, "I looked for 3 months, talked to every deer biologist I could reach in Virginia and 2 neighboring states. None of them had any explanation. There is no human activity that creates what we found. There is no animal behavior that creates it. No species in Virginia, no species in North America collects shed antlers and arranges them in any organized way. Corvids cache objects. Bowerbirds arrange objects in ways specific to their species. Nothing in North American wildlife science accounts for a 60-foot circular arrangement of hundreds of shed antlers built in concentric rings over 30 or more years." "What do you think it is?" I asked. He looked at his photographs for a moment. "I think it's old," he said. "Whatever it has been on Iron Mountain for at least as long as the outer ring of that arrangement, 30 years minimum, probably much longer. It's been collecting the mountain's sheds or directing the deer to shed where it wants them, which is an equally unsettling thought, and organizing them in a way that has meaning to it. What that meaning is, I cannot tell you." "Why do you think it arranged the newest shed to face outward?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "When I was a kid," he said, "my grandmother kept a house that was organized in a way that only made sense to her. Everything had its place, and if you moved something, she knew it immediately. Not because she had a list of where everything was, because she knew her house. She was continuously aware of it." He paused. "When we walked into that clearing, we were inside something's organization, its arrangement, the place it had built to mean something to itself. And the newest shed, the one it had placed most recently, turned outward toward us, not as a threat, not as a warning." He looked at the photographs. "As an acknowledgement. It knew we were there. It turned its newest piece toward us to say, 'I know you are here. I see you. You are inside something that is mine.'" I asked whether that frightened him. "Yes," he said. "Not because I think it wanted to harm us. We stood at the edge of that clearing for a long time and nothing happened, except a shed antler was oriented differently than it had been. Nothing came out of the timber, nothing charged, nothing threatened. But the scale of what was there, the 30 years of collection, the arrangement, the geometry of it, the scale of it says that whatever built that grove has been in those mountains for a long time and has a relationship with that terrain and its animals that is older than our relationship with it, deeper than ours. We were guests in someone else's house, and the host noticed us. And the host was not small." He closed the photograph folder. "We were shed hunting," he said. "We were looking for things the deer left behind, and we found a place where something else was doing the same thing in a way that made our 11 years of effort look like the beginning of a hobby." He said it without bitterness, with a specific, calibrated humility that came from having stood at the edge of something that made you feel correctly small. "Will you go back someday?" I asked. He thought about it for a long time. "No," he said. "Iron Mountain belongs to it. We walked the edges of it for 11 years and we were welcome. What we found, we were not supposed to find that. I don't think it was being hidden. I think we just weren't supposed to go looking in that particular direction." He paused. "Now that we have, now that it knows we know, I think the right thing to do is to leave it alone, to walk away and let it have its grove and its mountain and its 30 years of what the deer gave it." "That's a generous reading," I said. "It didn't hurt us," he said simply. He was right. They had stood at the edge of something ancient and organized and aware, and they had walked away unharmed. The thing in the clearing turned a shed antler in their direction and left it at that. A notice. A register. "We know you were here. We know your kind has been here. We have been keeping our own records for much longer than you have been keeping yours." Iron Mountain, Smyth County, Virginia. A clearing on the south-facing slope between 2 drainages, 60 feet across. Hundreds of shed antlers arranged in concentric rings from the oldest at the edge to the newest at the center, every tine pointing inward. 30 years of collection. At minimum. 3 shed hunters found it in March. They stood at the edge and counted the rings and understood the scale of what they were looking at. And the thing that built it knew they were there. And it turned its newest piece to face them. And it stayed where it was. And they left. The grove is still there. The clearing is still there. Whatever walked to that mountain in February and left a fresh shed at the top of the center construction left it this year too. And the year before. And the year before that. And every year for 30 years before any of us knew it existed. We come to the mountains in March and we look for what the deer left behind. We find shed antlers on the ground and we pick them up and we carry them home and we feel, rightfully, the specific pleasure of having found something the mountain offered. Something else comes to the mountain in March. And what it finds, it keeps. And what it builds carefully and for a very long time and to a purpose we do not understand. The next time you are shed hunting in the Virginia mountains, in the March brown timber on a south-facing slope, and the approach keeps pulling you in a direction you didn't plan to go, let it. Follow the terrain. Stay on the ground you're supposed to be on. Some clearings are not for finding. If the antler grove stayed with you, if you're thinking about what 30 years of patient collection looks like, about what it means to be noticed by something old enough to have been building since before you started looking, leave me a comment below. Have you ever found something in the woods on a shed hunt that you couldn't explain? Something that made you feel like you'd walked into the wrong part of the mountain? I want to hear it. Every shed hunter has a story. I read every comment. Virginia Blood and Bone continues. More stories coming from the deep woods and the long ridges of Virginia's Blue Ridge. Subscribe and hit the bell. You don't want to miss what's next. Walk the ground you know. And when the terrain tries to pull you somewhere you haven't been before, think about why it might be pulling you there and whether you really want to see what's at the end of that pull.